Okay, we might start off. So welcome to today's signature lecture of the ARC Center of Excellence for Enabling Eco-Efficient Beneficiation of Minerals. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. And we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. And so today we have the pleasure of hearing from Éléonore Lèbre, who's a research fellow at the Sustainable Minerals Institute in UQ. And rather than, many of these talks are quite technical in nature, but I think it's really important that we hear from Éléonore and other people about things which affect the people and the places around mining projects. And she's going to talk to us about the environmental, social, and governance impacts around mining projects. So with that, thank you, Éléonore. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks again for inviting me to present today. So I work in the Sustainable Minerals Institute, which is an applied research institute really focused on the mining industry. And to just give you a bit of background, so I was the first postdoctoral researcher appointed as part of the complex orebodies program, which is a multidisciplinary program that was supposed to be cross-cutting across the different centers of the institute. And it was initially the idea of the current acting director of the institute, Rick Valenta, who proposed this program and who's a geologist by background. But I'm also fully part of the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining. So that's why there is also quite a strong social component in my work. So I'll talk a bit about complex orebodies first and the approach we have taken. So over the past 5 years, really, then I spent a bit of time talking about a particular paper that we published, and then I'll go a bit in more detail in the spatial data that we use in our work. So what are complex orebodies? So I think that the primary idea of the complex orebodies program was to say that the complexity in mining development is not just mineralogical complexity. So it's not just below ground complexity, it's also about the above ground context in which mining takes place. So it's about the environmental, social, and governance context around mining. So that's why we have phrased it as ESG complexity. The second point that's important as well to keep in mind is that, in mining, more than maybe any other sectors, location matters. You cannot move an ore body from one place to another. You have to deal with whatever is there. And so mining activities take place in a unique ESG context. And so really the core of the work that we've been doing has been to use global spatial data to characterize ESG context and assess the level of complexity in mining locations. And hopefully you'll understand a bit better what I mean by complexity in the next slides. So this has been the approach. So on one side, we have a commercial database. So on this left side of this slide, commercial database that gives us the location of mining projects around the world. So it's the S&P global database that we access. That gives us the location of ore bodies and mining projects at different development stages. So you have early stage exploration, feasibility study stages, but also operations and closed projects. So all the stages gives us the commodities that are being targeted, reserves and resources, tonnage, grades, who is the operator, who is the owner of the project, and especially the spatial coordinates. So we know exactly where these projects are on the map. And on the other side, on the right side, we overlay this map of mining projects with a selection of spatial data sets. We have refined this methodology over time, but we use a combination of spatial data sets that help us characterize the context around mining. And so that what's important to say here is that these ESG data that characterize the local context, they don't characterize mining activities or mining performance or practices around mining. They really characterize pre-existing conditions that tell us about the context in which mining takes place. So I'll just go through them quickly one by one, so you just have a little bit of an idea of what's in there, but I'll go a bit deeper later on. So that will be really the topic of this presentation, which is to really go a bit deeper in all of these dimensions. But for now, keep it high level, so just understanding the general approach. So first we have biodiversity. So we have lots of data for biodiversity, understanding that projects may be located in areas that are key for the conservation of biodiversity. So we have a data set on the biodiversity areas. We also use a data set on protected areas, which gives us what is the level of protection of these areas and what could be regulatory permitting issues for mining projects because of that level of protection. Water, I'm sure many of you know, water is an important resource in mining. Mining consumes a lot of water, so we wanted to understand what is the availability of fresh water around mining projects, and also understand the level of competition between different water users that could be located close to the mining projects. Waste is maybe a little bit more complicated to explain, but understanding that big challenges in containing mining waste are sometimes related to local conditions. So of course, seismic risk can be a factor contributing to tailings dam failures, amongst other things, of course, and as well as climatic events, precipitations or more extreme climatic events. So it's about containing waste over the long term and how these local conditions can influence it. And so now we're going into the social dimension. So we had we wanted to just simply characterize whether there were local communities living directly close to the projects or in close proximity to the project, but also understanding sometimes the demographic around the projects, including how remote the communities are, understanding that remoteness can be a factor of vulnerability for these communities. And more generally, understanding social vulnerability around the project. And for that, we have a combination of indicators such as the Human Development Index, the Gini coefficient, which measures inequalities across the country. So these are more national level indicators. And we also have a bit more detailed maps, such as the Indigenous Peoples Land map. I'll talk a bit more about it in the next part of the presentation. And of course, land uses. So land is a very important resource, of course, in mining. It's all about accessing land and acquiring land. So understanding that there can be prior uses of that land. And one of the big uses of the land is for agriculture, and livelihoods may depend on these prior activities. So we have maps of croplands, pasture lands, for example. And then also it's about understanding the governance context, so at the national level mostly. So what is the quality of regulations in the country in which mining takes place? What is the perceived level of corruption? And we have lots of other indicators. So this is just a quick summary. We have used, I think for the particular paper that I'm presenting today, we have used 24 different indicators that have been aggregated into these 7 dimensions and then further aggregated into one big ESG score. And that's where the complexity aspect comes into play. So what we said in our work was that a high ESG score translates into complexity. So it means that many of these dimensions are coming together in the same location, and it means a high degree of difficulty in mitigating future impacts of mining. Basically, there is probably not one simple solution to mitigating impacts. It's much more complex, and it also translates into potential constraints to mining development because of the complexity. And again, I just highlight that these spatial data sets tell us about the context, not about practice and performance. So obviously, what miners make out of this existing context will be very determining for the future of the mining project and of the local context as well. So as I said, I'm just going to focus, I think, the next 5-10 minutes on the paper that we published in 2020 that applied this approach. And then later on, I'll just go do a deeper dive into the spatial indicators that we are using and explain a little bit more some of the challenges that we had in applying them and what is their potential, and also some of the constraints that we have in applying such type of data. So first, the application. So this is a paper that we published in Nature Communications in 2020, and we focused on metals that are needed in the energy transition, so the so-called energy transition metals, and understanding where resources of these metals are located, and particularly mining projects that are currently being developed. So the spatial overlay resulted in a number of maps. I won't go into the details here, but just to show that, yeah, from the points on the map for mining projects, and applying the different indicators, we ended up having lots of different maps. But we presented also the results in this type of matrix, colored matrix and figure. So I think I'll just mainly comment on this figure today. So on the left panel, you can see the 7 dimensions. The 7 first columns are the 7 dimensions. Then you have the 3 environmental dimensions that are aggregated into 1 column, and the 3 social dimensions that are aggregated into 1 column as well. So that gives us some information about different metals. So we see, for example, that for lithium, the main dimension appears to be water. That's one example. And then you have panel B, which provides a breakdown of resources. So what basically this says, and you have platinum on the top, because platinum in our analysis and cobalt were the 2 commodities that had the highest proportion of resources in high or very high complexity contexts. So these were really highlighted as at the top of the list. But what was interesting as well was to see that the other commodities that we analyzed also had high proportions of resources in high or very high complexity contexts. So between lithium and silver, between these metals had 30 to 60% of resources in high or very high contexts. So I think this figure tells us a lot, because I think we hear a lot about cobalt, particularly being located in Congo, and you know, issues related to child labor, and how basically cobalt should be avoided as a commodity altogether. But what we want to say in this analysis is to say that it's not about Congo, it's about where resources are located, and some of these resources for lithium or copper or silver are in contexts that are just as complex as cobalt. So it paints a much more a complex picture of compared to what you can hear in the media, for example. And platinum and cobalt are still highlighted as quite high because of the concentration of resources in specific countries. But it's not the case for other commodities like copper that are much more spread out. But still, overall, there can be a quite high level of complexity taking all of the resources together. So. And then the second part of that figure, so I'll talk about panel C now. So we compared this ESG profile with what we expect in terms of demand in the energy transition. So panel C highlights the typical commodities that you hear about that are needed for very specific applications, but not in very high quantity, but in very specific applications. And because these metals haven't been used in the past much, what we expect in terms of increase in demand is very significant. So typically that's cobalt, rare earths, lithium. So that's the ratio of what is expected to be the peak future demand compared to current demand. So of course, big surge in demand for these commodities. But what is more interesting from a mining perspective is panel D. And that's where you see that copper and iron are very significant when you take into account the mined ore tonnage and basically all of the material that needs to be excavated to extract copper and iron, and for these metals to be used in energy transition related purposes. So it's only the demand related to the energy transition. And so what it means is that because we need much more copper and much more iron in terms of absolute quantity compared to these other specialty metals, that will result just simply in more mines, bigger mines. So from a mining perspective, looking at what we need for the energy transition, copper and iron are really the commodities that matter the most. So understanding their ESG profile is probably the priority. So main takeaways from this paper. So first of all, pointing out that this is a dynamic assessment. So of course, reserves and resources evolve all the time, and the analysis was based on what was known about reserves and resources back in 2020. So that can evolve quite quickly. But I think, yeah, we were hoping that this approach could serve as some kind of a tool for decision making. So and we've had interest recently from geological surveys from different countries, because they find it important to be able to map the local context around mining and to understand it at the national level and to be able to make decisions. Basically, maybe understanding where areas are particularly sensitive to mining development, and maybe introduce more safeguards in these particular areas. So I think it's a tool that can be used by governments to really better understand their local context, their national context. But at the end of the day, industry's action will make a difference. So we have this pre-existing context that we try to categorize, but then mining, we don't know anything about actual mining practices in these locations. So the question is, is the industry adequately resourced to manage the level of complexity that we have identified? Can industry work across several dimensions to identify solutions to complex multidisciplinary problems? So that was a big, the question that we really wanted to ask, given the results that we had from our study. So now I'll just spend a bit more time talking about the spatial data that is available that can be used, because all of the ESG indicators that we've used is publicly available. And there is a very big diversity of ESG data now. So I just wanted to talk a bit more about this. And talking a little bit more about, as I'll spend probably a bit more time talking about social data. It's also the data that is a bit more problematic or harder sometimes to get good data on, and it's harder to get good quality, high resolution social data. So I wanted to highlight it as well as part of the challenges that we had, and I'll try as well to illustrate how this data can be visualized in practice, like using some examples of how some of these areas come together and create complexity at the local level. So first, looking about you'll see the dimensions that I talk about, they don't necessarily overlap with the general approach that you've seen before. So that don't worry about that too much. So we had the dimensions about communities, and communities is really probably one of the most complex aspects to try to characterize using spatial data, because there are many things that you cannot understand with just the spatial data that is available. What is even the community in mining? I mean, you have the local people, the homeowners, you have local businesses. Temporarily, things change as well. So you have communities that were existing before the mine was developed, and then you have mine workers and their family. You have a phenomenon of in-migration. So the demographic profile of local communities changes over time. So just characterizing that is a very complex task in itself. And then there is the question of what type of community is it? And we, in our work, we have tried to analyze specifically particular communities that we call land-connected people. So that's indigenous people and agrarian communities that rely on the land for their livelihoods. And then there is also questions of artisanal miners, which is a very specific kind of local community because their activity directly competes with large-scale mining. So communities is a big question, and we only have partial answers using spatial data. So I just wanted to talk about a few data sets that we've used to first just understand whether there is a community nearby. So is there people that are living directly close to the mining project, or even sometimes on top of the ore body, and understanding that proximity, but also understanding the level of remoteness. So how many people live in a 100-kilometer radius around the project, for example. So we have data sets, global data sets that give us population density in different places around the world. So that's one of the data sets that we've used. To understand remoteness, we can also use night light, which gives us also information about their people's access to electricity, and also road network. So that's also an indication of how remote communities can be and how accessible they are by transport and how far they are from big economic centers. So lots of data that can be used to try just to understand a little bit better what kind of community is living nearby mining projects. We also have, as I mentioned before, a map of indigenous people's land. And when we first found this paper, which is a great paper, we were very excited about being able to use this data. We thought, oh, it's a very high resolution, very useful data set for us. But it raised a few questions later on, because it was a matter of, okay, are projects falling in or out indigenous people's land? And unfortunately, these questions are more complex than that. It's not just about whether a mining project is falling in or out. There are big variations across countries. And the level of recognition of the land varies across countries as well, and how recognized the land is by government, for example, and what are the rights of indigenous peoples on the land. So unfortunately, we have this great global map, but interpretation can be tricky. And I take, for example, the example of Australia and even Papua New Guinea. So for those of you who know a bit Papua New Guinea, you'd be surprised that there is a complete blank on indigenous peoples land in Papua New Guinea. So obviously that's a gap in data. And just talking about the local context in Australia, so that's how mining projects have to deal with indigenous peoples when they have to. So basically, yeah, the regulatory background in Australia says that native title holders only have limited rights to their land, and mining activities have to negotiate with indigenous people. So it's about negotiating an agreement. And the land access is supposed to be conditional on the active participation of traditional owners in the management of their land and cultural heritage. But the presence of an agreement doesn't necessarily mean that all negative impacts on indigenous communities are avoided. So of course it's not as simple as that. So that's one national context that is different from other countries. You can see, for example, how in Zimbabwe the reality is very different. So in Zimbabwe, there was the indigenization and economic empowerment bill that was created in 2008. And this bill gives Zimbabwean rights to take over and control many foreign-owned companies in Zimbabwe. More than 51% of all businesses will be transferred into local African hands. The bill defines an indigenous Zimbabwean as any person who, before the 18th of April 1980, was disadvantaged by unfair discrimination on the ground of his or her race, and any descendant of such person. So very different context in Zimbabwe. It's about sharing. So it's about indigenous peoples having actual shares in mining projects. So one global map doesn't tell us everything. That's the point I was trying to make. Also, so just very quickly mentioning artisanal mining, and unfortunately there is no global map to tell us where artisanal mining activities take place, at least not at a very high resolution level. I just wanted to point out that sometimes you can find data at the national level, as it is the case in Brazil. And in some countries, it is very important to have this data because, as you can see, the land that has been disturbed by artisanal mining activities in Brazil is actually larger than the land that is disturbed by large-scale mining operations. So very important in some regions to understand artisanal mining, and unfortunately we haven't been able to do a global spatial analysis on this topic. I'll quickly move to just talking a bit more about a few more of the social dimensions. So land uses, we have, as I mentioned, agricultural land uses, and again, quite a lot of variations across countries. So that's a map of Mexico, and these yellow polygons that you can see are ejidos, which are pieces of land farmed communally under a system supported by the state. So that's a very specific characteristics of Mexico, and as you can see, this is quite a large, significant land use across the country. And if you look at a bit more closely at those red triangles and those squares, these are where mining operations are located and where conflicts related to mining are happening as well. So those big squares are conflicts. And interestingly, all of these conflicts are actually located on ejidos land. So that could be a factor. Competing land uses could be a factor. I just wanted to give an example of a mine in Mexico that had a bunch of issues related to agricultural land uses, but also the water uses for agriculture. So it's not just about land, it was about water as well. And the communities expressed their opposition to the project using blockades, and so blocking the roads to prevent activities at the mine. The government was involved as well to try and resolve the issue and help with the dialogue. And so I won't go into the details, but it's a case where you had land-related problems, water-related problems, local opposition, government involved. So that's clearly a case of complexity where all of these dimensions come together. So again, on the topic of land uses, we have, as I said, we have a croplands global data set that we are using. There's also a pasture land global data set. There's also a forestry or forest land data set that we've been using. And on top, so you see this is Mongolia, so this is for the pasture land. And when it comes to pastures, we can wonder whether, because pasture is not as intensive of a land use as croplands. So how does mining impact or competes with pasture land in Mongolia? That's an interesting question to see how pastoral communities are affected by mining there. And you can also notice a slight problem with the data. I'm pretty sure that pasture land in Mongolia doesn't finish like this in a straight horizontal line. So just noting that global data, unfortunately, is far from perfect. And so also on the topic of forest, this is just a quick visualization of forest in Indonesia. So forest is important as well, so for forestry land uses, but also a part of the forests are protected forests. So it's also an overlap with the nature conservation dimension in the environmental dimension. So I just wanted to quickly mention an example of a project in Indonesia where the Indonesian government eased the legal restrictions on mining in protected forests to enable this project to happen, because this project was located in the protected forest, but this triggered opposition from local communities and local environmental NGOs who took their case to the World Bank, because World Bank was one of the investors in the project, and the World Bank then started a whole process to make sure that the project was not going to lead to catastrophic impacts for social and environmental context around the project. The report commissioned by the World Bank in the end recommended better community engagement and an improved impact assessment. But in the end, the project was allowed to go ahead and production started in 2020. Which is not the case for another project called Dairy, also in Indonesia, also in protected forest, where construction has been halted now for 16 years. So the proximity to forests and protected forests, of course, is regulated with overlooked by with oversight from governments. So there is the governance dimension that is closely interlinked with the issue of protected forests. Another example of protected forests in India that I thought very interesting, because in the case of Widya Bay in Indonesia, that was an issue that was happening before the project started. But in the case of this project in India, they were forced into closure after the operations were allowed to start. So forced closure in 2005, after a ruling by India's Supreme Court that the mine was illegal because it occupied a protected forest. Interestingly, another project about 10 kilometers away from that first project, in the same national park, extracting the same commodity by the same operator, this one was allowed to continue operating. So that shows how the governance dimension and the forest indicator come together to sometimes produce quite unexpected outcomes that probably we wouldn't be able to anticipate just with our use of global data. Just also quickly mentioning that there's lots of data on conflict as well, and we have used some of these data sets in the past. So that's also a big granular level in information if we want to look at the intersection between social, like violent conflicts and mining. So just quickly, I'll go just a bit quicker for the other dimensions, but just to say that for the environmental dimensions, typically data is better in the sense that it's higher resolution, more regularly updated, and often more accurate as well. An example is for nature conservation. We have 3 data sets that we like to use. There is the Last of the Wild, but this one is old, it's from 2009. So probably these last remaining areas of wilderness, if a new data set was produced now, they would find that these areas have shrunk a bit since 2009. This is the protected areas database, world database on protected areas, which is very frequently updated. very good quality. My computer kept crashing when I was using it because the file was so big and there are so many protected areas, and it's very, very high resolution, very good data set. We also use the key biodiversity areas, as I mentioned earlier, which is also a very good data set, very regularly updated as well. And I'll just keep this maybe, but yeah, I'll just keep this. And there is also another data set that we haven't necessarily used, but it's probably also a very good one to look at, is we can see where threatened species are located. And that has, of course, big implications for permitting and how mining projects have to put resources in place to mitigate the impacts on this particular threatened species. So that's two examples in Australia, the Hemlin skink and the pink-tailed worm lizard. In the second case, the project was assessed and approved, but in the first case, the company had to establish a program for relocating some of the individuals, and a program for surveying and a management plan. So that's another global database that can be used. Then just talking a bit more about another environmental dimension, which is the waste dimension. I mentioned seismicity earlier, which is a very useful global data set that we have. So this is the level of seismicity. And I mentioned as well precipitations, and we have access to the to very good spatial data to anticipate the level of precipitation in a given location. So it can be annual precipitation, so really at the yearly levels, or also the wettest month. So it tells us about what kind of extreme can be anticipated, or what, rather than the average for the year. So I think both types of numbers can be useful to use. And then just quickly mentioning water, and again, we have some good data, I would say, maybe a bit outdated, but quite high resolution at the catchment level all around the world. We have information about water stress, so that gives us information about the availability of water for mining, flood occurrence as well, seasonal variability, which tells us a bit about water management challenges when there is a high variability across seasons. And there is also a global data set for surface water, which can be quite significant in cases like here in northern Canada. Developing a site in this area obviously would have very big challenges of dewatering and containing waste and potentially dewatering a whole lake to access the orebody underneath it. And so, yeah, I just wanted to point out some country specificities related to water. And as I was analyzing project disclosures in particular countries, I thought that South Africa was a very interesting case because there was a lot of recurring issues that all had the issues that were recurring in many different projects in South Africa. So issues of heavy rainfalls and coupled with power shortages. So projects were having challenges dewatering the underground workings. On top of that, they had lots of worker strikes, and in the same locations, they had years where they had droughts, and they were asked to reduce their use of water. So that's all of the projects where I've seen these issues. So it's very interesting to see how a country can have all of these challenges coming together around a big number of mining projects. So finally, just wanted to conclude with some of the governance indicators that we are using. And here I'm grouping all of the indicators that are at country level. So basically, there is just one value per country. And obviously, that's not optimal if we want to understand the local context around mining, but that also tells us about the more general national context. And when it comes to governance and regulations and political stability, all of these things are more perhaps more relevant at the national level. So we've used the worldwide governance indicators from the World Bank. That's 6 different indicators on political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. So that these indicators are very good. They get updated also very frequently. I put some definitions here for people if they want to look back at it. There is country risk. So that's from the S&P Global database. And it's more about risks that mining companies would be concerned about. So tax risk, security risk, operational risk. So these are typically the dimensions that companies would care about, I would guess. And I also wanted to highlight this index from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. So that's a resource governance index. So it's specifically designed to understand the governance quality around the mining industry. So I think that's an important one that we've used in the past. And there is a lot of national level data. So the World Bank website will have a lot of data. The United Nations website also has a lot of data. This is the Human Development Index that you see that evolution over time for lots of different countries. We've used the Human Development Index at the national level, but unfortunately we have to acknowledge that the local level reality would be quite different from these national averages, especially for the Human Development Index. Obviously, levels of income, levels of education, levels of health, which are all included in this index, they would vary. There would be a big difference between urban regions, more rural regions. It's the same for governance and for the quality of public services, for example. Obviously, there would be a big difference depending on different regions in the country. So yes, a lot of data, but I would be very careful in applying them, because if we want to characterize the local level, understanding that local level can be quite different from these national averages. So now I'm getting towards the end of the talk, and I just wanted to summarize all of this together and bring this back to the overall complex orebodies approach. So overall, what I've learned over the past 5 years working on this project, I just wanted to start maybe with the bad stuff, and I'll end with the more positive aspect. So overall, what I've learned is working with global data, one has to be very careful about data quality. So unfortunately, in many cases, we have data that is low resolution, sometimes outdated, and sometimes even just plain wrong. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's oversimplified as well. So we have seen the case of the Indigenous Peoples Land Map that only represents a part of the reality, which brings me to my second point, which is being careful when interpreting the data. So these data sets are only proxies. The indicators that we created are proxies for reality. So we need to keep that in mind. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is we only provide the part of a complex equation. So again, it's about the pre-existing context. It's not about the practices of mining projects in that context. And also, I would be particularly careful in trying to quantifying the unquantifiable, which is the case of many of the social aspects around mining. But that being said, I want to end on a positive note and say that, so overall, I found that maps are very powerful in representing multidisciplinary and complex issues. I think it's been particularly suitable for our work in mining, because, as I said, in mining, location matters, and mining activities are somehow shaped by the context in which they are located, and mining, of course, shapes its context as well. So it's a very complex interaction between mining and its context. So I think this approach was very suitable for our research on the mining industry. I also think that this approach has been extremely adaptable, and we've been able to apply it to a wide range of research questions, because every time you can choose different data sets depending on what your research question is. I've shown an example of using lots of indicators and combining them into big ESG dimensions, but we can also use fewer indicators to answer more, I guess, more specific questions. And also wanted to highlight that I think with this work, we've made a good contribution to the critical minerals literature. For those who don't know critical mineral literature, it's about characterizing supply risk. And the way it's been done in the past was to look at how resources were concentrated in different countries, and using the Human Development Index, for example, or the worldwide governance indicators to look at the risks in these particular countries. So critical minerals literature has basically done studies using national level indicators. And what we've shown is that we can go a bit at a finer scale and go down to the local level where minerals are being extracted. So basically, we've added a level of, we've increased the resolution level for critical mineral studies. So I think this was also a relevant contribution. And that's it. I think I'll leave whatever I have left of time. I'll leave time for questions. Thank you.